Hello and welcome to Practical Inclusion. I want to start today by acknowledging the Wadawurrung people. That's whose lands that I live, work and play on. And I want to pay my respects to their elders past and present. It's always feels like such a privilege to live on Wadawurrung country where I am. Just at the bottom of my hill is the Barwon River, which is still looking very majestic based on the flooding that has occurred and the size of it. But it's always a constant reminder too of the people who have lived on this land for such a long time, way before white settlement, and really do know how to look after this country in a way that we're not looking after it at the moment. So for me, it's the voice to Parliament next year is hopefully an opportunity for us to be able to have that voice in Parliament that really can talk to the things that we need to be doing much differently with this land, and hopefully hand the land back where it should be, being looked after in the way that it should be and was done for such a long time. Today I need to put an apology up front. Words aren't coming out my mouth the way I would like them to. I am just back from COVID. This was my second bout and this hit me way harder than the first one. And so I'm not going to make a lot of sense, but that's okay because it's not about me. I've got an excellent guest on today who's going to be able to hold the conversation and share a lot with you, I'm sure. Feels, again, a real privilege to have Sally on the show today. I have learnt so much from her over my time in diversity and inclusion. Attended many events that she has spoken at, so I feel really privileged to have her come on this show and talk to us about her experience, lived experience, but also her professional knowledge as to how we create more inclusive and diverse spaces. So Sally, without any further ado, I'd like to hand over to you. Before I do, for those who are watching live or on the replay, please type your comments, questions in the chat. If it's live and you get them into there, I'll raise them with Sally and we can discuss them on the spot. So just wanted to say that. Sally, over to you. Tell us a little bit about yourself, as much as you would like to share in this space with us, and I guess the type of work that you're doing in the inclusion space.
Thanks, Bree. Yeah, and welcome your comments, questions, and dare I say queries as well. So I'll start by saying that at this time, on the 13th of December 2022, I am a 57-year-old bi-pan trans neurodivergent Jewish woman, amongst other things, which I think is a good lead into diversity. And before I go further, though, I would, as per my Zoom, it's not a Zoom handle, platform handle, acknowledge that I'm on Kulin Bollen lands, which specifically the Bollen was the name of the local billabong and has now morphed into day-to-day usage as Bulleen, a suburb about 15 kilometres east of what is now the Melbourne CBD. So yeah, as a 57 and a bit year old person of various backgrounds, I think life has been very much in two halves. I sometimes call 27 April 1995 at a physical age 29 and a half the birthday of my spirit, in a sense, because I don't think there was any real spirit living before that. And of course, let's sort of try to zap through that first half of life, not to overlook anything, but just to talk about what happened. So someone born in 1965 and assigned male, the assumption, of course, far more strongly than even today, which is still possibly the majority, is that if you're assigned male, because we hold a child up and look at a body, that you're going to be a boy and later a man, and there's no other possibilities for gender identity, and for that matter, you'll only be attracted to women. And my life started, perhaps in a sense, to sort of not be as not good as it could have been in February 1970, when at 4 years and 3 months I started school in what was then called prep. And I remember clearly being at the door of that classroom and almost looking back at 10 metres behind me at 7 o'clock, so to speak, and wanting to run back to her, not just because it was first day at school. It was like, something's not, with hindsight, of course, something's not right here. And the reason for that is because it was an all-boys school. So there's already that feeling of something's not right here. Where are all the different people? Where are people like me? That sort of thing is how I describe it now. And, you know, of course, the 70s, we hadn't really thought about things to do with gender or sex a lot, or sexuality, but it was more about gender and how we expected, and gender identity and gender expression. And I don't think this would have been much different at any so-called all-boys school in that time. And, you know, there was a lot of pressure to be good at sport and only a very few particular sports and play them in a certain way. And the thing that got me through school was I was relatively sound academically, and however, it was a double-edged sword in that whilst I won a full academic scholarship to commence at grade 4, when I sat for an exam in grade 3, it meant that I had to stay at school until successful completion of what is now year 12. Otherwise, my parents would have had to pay back all the fees they would have paid. And I hope that isn't happening now, because I have to be frank, I call that child abuse. It's not in the interest of the child to stay there if the child is unhappy. I was verbally bullied for most of what is now called years 7 and 8. And it really put a lid over my development. And something I've learned since is that I remember being at a day of a broad range of lived expertise, and I've just heard about people who had, I'll use the phrase, disrupted childhoods of a range of backgrounds. But I will come back to that side of it. So to keep it short, I finished school, I went to university, I did a Bachelor of Commerce majoring in accounting. I tried working as an accountant and tried to be in the corporate sector, which was sort of what was expected, but it wasn't working. And it was an unhappy time. I just didn't fit that sort of more also masculine environment. And in 1994, I resigned and I travelled for 3 months, which relieved surface stress, but I think also brought up what I'd been unknowingly pushing down. And that brings us back, to keep it short, to 27 April 95, when a psychologist who listened carefully, which I think is something we don't do well enough in all settings, and I would ask people to reflect a little, as put this in the back of your mind while you listen. Did anyone on this event today have any structured listening skills training prior to 18 years old? Yet listening is at least 50% of our communication. We're taught how to read, which is receiving information, but are we taught really how to listen? And I think we'd do well to think about that, and I'll come back to that. But the psychologist listened and then said, has anyone ever explained this to you this way? And this was for me as someone assigned male. Some men are more feminine than masculine. Some need to be female. That's called transgender. And of course, that's not a precise definition or inclusive enough by today's standards for trans men and non-binary, and those beyond the binary, to be precise. But the gist of it is pretty accurate, and the light bulb came on. So life, which had been going south, hit the brakes and did a U-turn and began to come back north. And over the next 27 years or so, I've had to, I love this. This is one of my favourite book titles. It's by Anthony Van Brown, who's a former Pentecostal preacher and also a gay man. His book is called A Life of Unlearning. And I think we all have things to unlearn. And so I had to unlearn and relearn lots of new things. I learnt that I wasn't only attracted to women, that in 1997 I realised I could be attracted to men, and then later, when there was more talk of beyond the binary, other genders, which is hence why I use both bi and pan. They both have an emotional resonance for me. In 1998, I realised I needed to live authentically, read gender identity and gender expression, and that's when I affirmed my identity as a woman, as I truly am. But there was also lots more to it after that. In 2001, I'll use the word, was recognised with the mental health situation of cyclothymia, which in simple terms is a smaller version of bipolar 1 and 2. There's some ups and downs in moods, which is similar, although according to what research we have, and it's interesting, even though this is in the DSM, it's not talked about, that being cyclothymia, that it's more triggered by external factors than internal chemical issues. In 2004, I claimed the introvert part of myself, which people always say is surprising, but is one of the introverts books say when introverts are talking about something we're passionate about, we come across as very extroverted, which I think is probably what I'm doing now. I also had a huge breakthrough working with a life coach who was very fair and said, look, I need to point something out. You seem to take a very glass half empty view of the world. And I just hadn't realised that. It was totally understandable that I had, but we all have these unconscious biases about all sorts of things. In 2005, talking neurodivergence was when I first heard about the term the highly sensitive person, or HSP. No, not a halal snack pack or a Hellenic snack pack. But do I eat myself? That's an ethical question for another time. I heard about it, and I will mention there was a blog for a book called A Career Guide for Creative and Unconventional People by a woman by the name of Carol Eichelberry, and that's where I heard about this term. I thought, oh, that's interesting. Headed over to the HSP website run by a major pioneer in this work, Elaine Aron, and did the self-test. And it's like, oh, hello. So more unlearning and relearning. And there's been lots of other things since, just learning then about stuff as myself as a person. And I'm, there's, due to time, I won't go through a lot of it, but I will say that perhaps deep down there is, because of the first part of my life where I didn't feel I got the support I needed, not just to stop bullying, but other things, that I'm a little wary of people in positions of power because they might misuse it. And maybe that's justified, but you've also got to say, well, is that holding me back? So that's the things we have to keep learning, unlearning, and recalibrating. Just to give some thoughts, not to dismiss my own story, but one of my highlights of this year is it was the 40th anniversary of, I'll be intergenerational learning, HSC, when I was at school, year 12 as it is now. One of my friends went to the reunion, and one of the three main people who bullied me at that time in years 7 and 8 had expressed some remorse. And to keep it short, two things have happened. One is that we had a coffee together a few weeks ago where he again apologised to my face, directly to me, which is, I think, very decent and emotionally mature. And the thing also that came out of that was we're thinking of what we might do to sort of bring people back into the school network. My thoughts at the moment are, if he wrote his side of the story, I wrote mine and said, look, I've accepted the apology. Maybe it will help people who perhaps felt disconnected from the school due to bullying to come back and reconnect with the school community. And I think that's been amazing. The other part of the school reunion was I did reconnect with the alumni network, and the head of it sent me a picture on where at Purple Day, flying over this traditional school quadrangle setting, was the rainbow flag, which blew my mind. And I think that's a really wonderful thing. So that's sort of my story, which, I think would, invoke lots of thoughts, but let's also have some discussion about practical issues and then broader learnings as well.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you, Sally, for sharing that. And to those who are watching, please put any comments or questions for Sally in there. It's not often that we get this time to talk to her about her life story. Sally, a few things stood out for me there, and I'm interested in your thoughts around what we commonly hear, and I know that you would hear this a lot too from people, is that, that was back then, this is now, things are so much easier now for LGBTIQA plus young people. And we know that that's true to some extent, but also what do you see as still are the big issues that are standing out for particularly young trans people?
I think that we have made, obviously progress. And I think that one of the joys of my life when I do feel, and there have been challenges in my life and my advocacy and diversity work, is I hold to an image when the fabulous group Transcend, who do awesome work, had one of their end of year picnics a couple of years ago, and I got invited along as a sort of elder. And I'm sitting there watching a whole heap of young people running around, and I don't know which are cis and which are trans/gender diverse, but they all seemed happy. And that's the really good thing, which touches into that point about disrupted childhood. So the fact that there are so many young people at least getting a chance to get their life, not only in relation to gender or sexuality, but then that flows through to their whole life, getting it started early is really good. And so I think that's important we acknowledge that. And that's a huge joy that people will not have to have as much delay to their life as I've had. But we still have challenges, and I know I'm going to say content note. I think what comes to mind is the situation that emerged last week in relation to the event at the Pride Centre in Melbourne, where a drag storytelling event had to be postponed, and there's lots of valid arguments about that. But it says that people are trying to use trans people, particularly younger trans people, and anything to do with gender as some sort of wedge tactic, and that's not good enough. And so there's still that issue there that people are spreading inaccurate information. And I just find it bizarre that I know my life, every trans and gender diverse person knows all of their lives. And whilst, of course, there's the old running joke in the trans community about if you've heard one trans story, you've heard one trans story, there are common threads, I think, that you would find that for people of my age bracket, it was this, well, we didn't have information, we didn't know, I thought I was the only one, that isolation. And we can't all be wrong. And I just find it bizarre. My sense of logic says, how can people rewrite my life story and that of all of the trans community? But that then leads to, well, if we can't explain something logically, and I think this is a strong point, what's the emotional block that some people have? And I think this is where, in terms of diversity, we all have emotional blocks. We all have things that we either can't see or there is an emotional block. And again, content note this time for racism, but I think it's something worth talking about. And that was a situation that emerged 18 months ago in relation to Kamal and Hey Hey It's Saturday. And when Kamal spoke up about how humiliated he felt at the racism he endured, and then I think John Blackman, the booth announcer, replied, well, why didn't you just come up to the booth and talk to me? Well, that shows a lack of awareness of privilege, that it's not easy for people who have been marginalised to stand up to oppressors and keeps, that's ableist, to, assert themselves against oppressors and, sort of keep asserting themselves. It can be draining, and this is why, of course, we need allies. And I acknowledge my privilege as someone who is white and neither Aboriginal nor Torres Strait Islander. But the point of the Kamal story, I had lots of happy emotions about Hey Hey It's Saturday as a kid. And there were lots of stories about the show or interactions with my family watching the show that, are in stories. But I then had to temper those emotions and say, okay, Kamal was treated like garbage. And so it's about trying to find that balance and holding space for a range of possibilities. And that means we all have to do the work to emotionally unblock and be open to learning to do it, which I think is so critical to do diversity better. And I'm not perfect on diversity, but I'd also be willing to say there's probably not one person on the planet who is. And that's because we can't know everyone else's experience. And that's where I'll link it back holistically to listening. We need to learn to listen and there are lots of blocks to listening, including emotions of all sorts. And there are things that, stop us listening the other way. When people do attack us, it's very hard to remain calm, and we don't have to all the time. But that's where I think we've got things we can do in relation to diversity as to how we can just listen, take on other people, not take on, but just hold space for other people's experiences and keep learning, I suppose, is where I've gone off away from your original question, but it is about learning and opening our minds, but also opening our hearts and therefore being empathic. And I think that will help counter some of the extreme negativity that young trans and young LGBTIQA plus people are still facing.
Yeah, gosh, Sally, I feel like that's, what you've just described there is really like takeaway notes from the entire year of LinkedIn Lives that I've run this year, because that that point about listening is just so important. And what perhaps that we haven't unpacked before is that emotional connection that people have to the status quo or the way things have always been done. I don't think we probably spend enough time unpacking what that is. I had those same feelings about, hey, it's Saturday. It was every Saturday night. The family watched it together. We laughed at those jokes. And it's that same feeling of, wow, this was a really positive thing about my childhood. But actually, when I look at it, wow, it shaped a lot of negative behaviours and knowledge and biases in myself. And how many Australians were sitting down watching that same show every Saturday and taking on those messages. And the other point that I just want to really pull out, because it's been a theme of the work that I've been doing over the last few weeks, is this idea of power, and how we need to talk way more about power dynamics. And that example that you provide is the ultimate example, isn't it? It's why didn't you just come and talk to me? Well, I can tell you why, but it's complex and it's historical, and it requires us to sit down and for you to really listen. So I love that you've pulled that example out.
Yeah, there was one other point I wanted to make, and I've pulled up one of my favourite quotes, which I won't go through in full, and I will change some pronouns, from Eleanor Roosevelt. And it's the one about, where after all do human rights begin? In small places close to home, the neighbourhood they work in, the school or college they attend. Such are the places where every person seeks equal justice, equal opportunity. Unless these rights have meaning there, they have little meaning elsewhere. Without concerned citizen action to uphold them close to home, we shall look in vain for progress in the larger world. And that's where I see a big challenge in terms of diversity, where people mouth off words like diversity and respect, and we're aiming to change this law or whatever it is to make it more equal. And then they go and bully people in workplaces, or they make people work 100 hours a week, which for people who have faced trauma, as most marginalised communities have, that could be very, very difficult, and they'll burn the mat. The person ends up being burned out. So I think that it's that sort of thing that, whilst it's important to do things like, and I'll just suddenly do this, I've been somewhat invisible. Now, look, I've got a rainbow scarf on. That's great. And also, why is it bloody 15 degrees in Melbourne in summer? That's another question too, as to wearing a rainbow scarf in December. But, that's great. And checking in on people's pronouns with, hi, I'm Sally, I use she, her pronouns. Is it okay if I ask which pronouns you use, if any, is great. But I think it's about how we when I created this saying for myself, or this next saying, I try to ask myself, is every action I'm doing, in terms of what I'm doing and how I am doing it, coming from a place of kindness? And I think we can put that into practice more often, because I do see people who have this inconsistent approach to diversity will not look at privilege. And the elephant in the room is, unfortunately, at times we have thrown each other under the bus within LGBTIQA plus communities. Whilst it's great we got marriage equality, I understand what it's like to have a document that recognises that relationship. As I look across at my birth certificate that I got 2.5 years ago that now says female at last, I can't celebrate marriage equality for that reason. I have been told by people that there was a conscious decision to throw causes and groups and issues under the bus, and that's not acceptable. And also, Mardi Gras has a very poor record in its treatment of bi people and won't apologise, and I can't go to Mardi Gras for that reason. So I ask allies to stand with us, to do the emotional labour to fix these things and have these discussions, and not shut them down because of privilege or because it's too hard, or take on internalised prejudice where people say, well, you people don't agree on everything, so we don't listen to any of you. Well, we have this right to a range of opinions and perspectives as much as anyone else. And that's, again, where we need to hold space for everything and, listen to each other. Party A listens, Party B talks, you swap roles, and then you work through and come up with a better solution, not this shutting down that seems to happen a lot. And that's not, because shutting people down isn't really the answer. If people are genuine and sincere in wanting to reach a win-win solution, then you communicate through. But then we have to unblock and say, well, what do we learn?
Yeah, great. Absolutely. Thumbs up to that for sure. And thank you, Sally. I'm conscious we're just about at time. I've learnt so much just from what you've said today, let alone what I've heard you say in the past. If you're not following Sally on socials, please do, because it is daily learnings, and you share of yourself quite openly in those forums. So please jump on. Sally, did you have a final message that you wanted to send to the listeners today?
Yeah, I'll leave you with two last thoughts. I'll reiterate the idea about try to come from a place of kindness in what you do and how you do. And I'll also say that, listening also means seeing a person for who they see themselves as. Don't just assume because that person's been a certain way in the past that that's really who they are, I suppose. And that way we can also not only build our own capacity and potential, but then that has the ability to give leadership to others.
Yeah, thanks, Sally. And that's one of the key points I've pulled out too from what you talked about today, is that learning about ourselves can be a lifelong journey for many of us. I think for most people, right? But certainly for people who do sit outside what's considered the normal gendered expectations or expectations around sexuality, it can really delay our understanding of who we are. And I think that goes for other underrepresented and marginalised groups as well, that it can take longer to find out who we are when we do sit outside those typical societal norms, with inverted commas. And, to the way you've just described there, to actually give people the space and time to do that and to respect where they're at and what they're learning about themselves, and be open to listen about their experiences is of ultimate importance. Thank you so much for coming on today and sharing with us. I'd love to get you on again next year and talk about some other topics. For those who are listening in, thanks for listening in. This will be the last one for this year. Thanks for your engagement and comments and support for these LinkedIn Lives over the year. I will absolutely continue them next year. There's going to be some changes to my business, as there always is at the end of the year. Self-reflection, what needs to stay, what needs to get stronger, what needs to go. And I've had some really strong thinking around that during my COVID time off. And so you'll learn more about that over the coming weeks and into next year. But thanks for everybody's support, and we'll catch you next year. Thanks, Sally.
Thanks, Bree, and wishing everyone a safe and happy season.